the discussion. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is our third installment of our discussion of the reign of quantity and the signs of the times by René Guénon. Now we will be looking at chapter 2. Just to summarize the results of chapter 1, quality and quantity was chapter 1. We can really see that as a kind of exercise in the clarification of terms. And that was very much needed because the terms that he uses are subject to tremendous amount of confusion, as we talked about. But the essential points are that under quality, he has in mind terms in English form and essence and the Sanskrit purush. And so for essence, he has in mind the Greek eidos. We talked about that at length. And then in terms of matter, materia, hule, substance, that's all with quantity. It's associated with the Sanskrit prakriti. And that he prefers substance. So we've got essence and we've got substance. Essence goes with quality. Substance goes with quantity. And he didn't really talk much about quantity in that chapter. He was merely clarifying these things, and then he said, all right, now we've really got to lead into a proper discussion of what comes under substance and quantity, because that's really the central theme of the book, right? The characteristic of the modern world, of the Kali Yuga, of what is behind the reign of quantity. So let's look at that. This chapter is entitled Chapter 2, Materia, Signata, Quantitate. So matter marked or designated by quantity. We will find out as we go further in our discussion of the chapter that matter marked or designated by quantity is what the scholastics designate as materia secunda. Second matter or secondary matter or matter in the second sense, I suppose. He says, the scholastics gave the name materia, generally speaking, to what Aristotle called hule. But this materia, as has already been said, must in no way be identified with the matter of the moderns, for the idea of matter, complex and even in some ways contradictory as it seems to have been, as strange to the ancient Westerners as it still is to the Easterners. Now, this is an important point. When he says matter, he doesn't mean the matter of modern physics and chemistry. He has in mind the scholastic sense of materia. So what does that mean? Well, it's something else, but the term materia can refer to what is the modern sense of matter in certain special cases. Or, Guénon writes, rather to be more accurate, that the more recent conception can be made to fit into the earlier one. Materia, nevertheless, includes many other things at the same time, and it is these things that must be carefully distinguished from matter in square quotes, or in quotation marks, matter of the modern physicists, chemists, natural scientists. But for the purpose of naming them as a group, by some comprehensive term like hule or materia, we have no better word at our disposal in Western languages than the word substance. So he wants to use the term substance here to refer to hule. So it's not substance in the sense of ousia or the other senses we talked about in the previous lecture. So hule, again, is a universal principle. It is pure potency. In Latin, hule was called what? Materia prima, prime matter. In Arabic, al-hayula or al-maddatul ula. And it is pure potency. And so since it's pure potency, it isn't a composite of act and potency. It's pure potency. So it is kind of an abstraction. And so nothing is distinguished or actualized, as he says, and it constitutes the passive support, quote-unquote, of all manifestation. And it is for this reason that substance, as elaborated by Guénon, is identified further by him with the term Prakriti from the Sankhya Darshana of Indic philosophy, Indic thought. So he says everywhere, or everything that has been said elsewhere, he's obviously referring to his other writings about Prakriti, applies equally to Hule, thus understood. Now his footnotes are always kind of interesting. He says that the primary meaning of the word Hule in Greek, right, is related to the vegetative principle. In other words, plants. So what are plants characterized by? They're characterized by nutrition and growth. So in Aristotle, you have the vegetative soul.
Oh, the rational soul, animal soul, vegetative soul.
Yeah, but in ascending order, it's the vegetative soul, the animal soul, and the rational soul. So Hule is related to the vegetative principle. Here there is an allusion to the root, quote-unquote root, in scare quotes. And in Sanskrit, that is the term mula, is also a term applied to Prakriti, which is the starting point of manifestation. In this can be seen some connection, which does in fact plunge its roots into that which constitutes the obscure support of our world. Substance, indeed, being in a way the tenebrous pole of existence. Tenebrous means dark or murky, gloomy. So, in short, then, in the opening of this chapter, he is saying that the materia, which is the Hule materia of the scholastics, is in no way to be identified with the matter of modern science, physics, chemistry, etc. And in fact, it corresponds to the Indic idea, the Indic doctrine of the Prakriti. All right. So that's substance in its that's universal substance. Now, what about substance in a more particularized sense? So he says substance, understood in a relative sense as being that which represents analogically the substantial principle and plays its part in relation to a more or less narrowly restricted order of existence, furnishes the term Hule with a secondary meaning. That will be materia secunda. So the term in Greek, Hule, without further appellation or qualification, or in Latin, materia, without further appellation or qualification, can refer to materia prima, which is the universal aspect of the term, or in a relative sense. And when you have that relative sense, it acquires a secondary meaning, particularly when this term is correlated with eidos, which again for him is essence, in the Genonian, high-low, what did I call it? High-low ideism. So it's correlated with eidos to designate the two sides, essential and substantial, of particular existences. So this is really quite profound. So he's taking this notion of matter and form, which you find in Aristotle, and he's saying people didn't really understand it. The eidos is really connected to the idea of the Greek of Plato and the real notion of number of the Pythagoreans, and then in this way it can be correlated with Hule. Very, very interesting. And then, taken in their extreme and abstract form, they are then the two sides or the two poles, essential and substantial, of particular existences and of the whole order of manifestation. The scholastics, he goes on, following Aristotle, distinguish these two meanings by speaking of materia prima and materia secunda. All right, so materia prima, once again, is the universal substance. It is the Prakriti, and their materia secunda is substance in the relative sense. Now, the question then that should come to your mind is that, well, is materia secunda the matter of the physicists or not? He hasn't answered this question. But what he's going to say is that materia secunda is secundus because it is marked or designated by quantity. So he goes on, arguing that, let's see. Yeah, so is the materia secunda then identified with substance? Yes, it is, because he's using the term substance. So it is the substantia, it is the substratum, the support of our world of particular existences, of the world of manifestation. But also, this is on page 17, I'm reading now directly, but also beneath the whole of all the worlds and all the states comprised in universal manifestation. So it's not just our particular existences. It can be seen as the underlying, as he says, substratum for the whole thing. And again, substantia is from substare. Literally, as he says, that which stands underneath.
Yes.
Right? In addition, for the very reason that it is potentiality. Remember, substances, because it's materia prima, in the universal sense, it is pure potential. For the very reason that it is potentiality, absolutely undistinguished and undifferentiated universal substance is the only principle that can properly be said to be unintelligible. Not merely because we are not capable of knowing it, but because there is actually nothing in it to be known. Okay, as for relative substances, though, insofar as they participate in the potentiality of universal substance, so far do they also participate in its unintelligibility. Therefore, the explanation of things must not be sought on the substantial side. This is why the modern sciences are residues, because they do not go back to the essence. But on the contrary, it must be sought on the essential side. Translated into terms of spatial symbolism, this is equivalent to saying that every explanation must proceed from above and go below. And this observation has special relevance at this point, for it immediately gives the reason why modern science actually lacks all explanatory value. Now, maybe that's a harsh thing to say, but if you see it in the context of what he's arguing, then he's absolutely right. Modern science lacks all explanatory value because it does not ground itself in a higher principle and cannot explain anything in a higher sense. It's all surface. So now I think you can appreciate now that we have clarified these terms by actually doing the hard work, as we now say, the heavy lifting, and looking at these terms, it becomes much more
clear.
Exactly. So, people want things easy, but you can't really speak of ease without hardship. Ease is the correlative of hardship. So
Indeed.
You've got to do the hard work, and then it
There's a
becomes
saying of
easy.
Plato, Kalepa Takala, nothing beautiful without struggle.
Nothing beautiful without struggle. Yes, that's a marvelous, marvelous motto.
Exactly.
I remember I typed it up and put it on the board back when we did the homeschooling. Anyhow.
I remember we translated it. It was a sentence in one of my Greek classes. And I was like,
that's
I remember
the one.
that. I wish I had gotten that, but didn't.
Okay, so now remember the question which immediately comes to mind. So fine, now we understand there's something called materia secunda. Is it the materia or the matter of modern physics? Want to guess? He's going to answer it, of course. He says no. Let's see why. It should be noted here, page 18, it should be noted here that the physicist's matter can in no case, it's at the top of 18, paragraph 2, third line down. It should be noted here that the physicist's matter can in no case be anything, but a materia secunda. I misunderstood it. Since the physicists regard it as being endowed with properties on the nature of which they are incidentally not entirely in agreement, so that their matter is not potentiality and indistinction, and nothing else besides.
What's he saying there?
So he's saying, something here. He's saying that the physicist's matter can in no way be a materia prima. It has to be a materia secunda. And that is because, the physicists will talk about a so-called, in modern science, they'll talk about an inert matter, but there's really no such thing. Because matter, for the physicist, is endowed with certain properties. So if it is a composite substance in the sense of modern chemistry, it is composed of its elements, it has a chemical formula, and according to the conventions of modern chemistry, that chemical formula indicates the proportions of the presence of such and such an element in that compound. That's why it's called a compound. And then, it'll have a particular, it'll have all sorts of physical and chemical characteristics. So, if you just take an element, some sort of element in the periodic table, it has an atomic weight, it has an atomic number, the number and atomic weight, refer to its hierarchy within the 92 naturally occurring elements. It has something called an electronegativity, or correlatively an electropositivity. It has its natural state at so-called room temperature, which is usually 20 degrees Celsius at 1 atmosphere of pressure. It is either a solid or a liquid or a gas, etc., etc. If it's a metal, it has an electrical conductivity as a resistance. Yeah. So it's all of those things. So the point is, it's materia secunda because it has all of these manifold properties. But the nature of those properties, he says, on which they are incidentally not entirely in agreement. I'm not entirely sure what he means by that. I can't think of an example from a concrete example from chemistry or physics, but let's just read on. So that their matter is not potentiality and indistinction and nothing else. Besides, moreover, as the physicist's conceptions relate to the sensible world and do not go beyond it, they would not know what to do with the conception of a materia prima. Okay. And then he goes on to say what I just said, that, at the same time they speak of something called inert matter, which just doesn't make any sense because matter for them has these properties. And then he goes on to say that the only truly inert matter, if there could be such a thing, would be materia prima, which is the only thing that can really be characterized by, in more modern English we would say inertness, but he's more correct and he says inertia.
Yes.
But again, it's not inertia in the sense of Isaac Newton, where an object that is at rest tends to stay at rest, and where an object that is in motion tends to stay in motion, in both cases, unless that is changed by some other intervening or impeding force. Right. So he has to make that clarification. So now the question arises, he says, after setting aside the notion of inertia of matter or inert matter, and that this is just a complete absurdity, whether matter, endowed as it is with the more or less defined qualities that enable it to be manifested to our senses, is the same thing as the materia secunda of our world as understood by the scholastics. Doubt will at once arise as to the validity of any such assimilation if it be noted that the materia secunda in question, if it is to play a part in relation to our world analogous to that played by materia prima or universal substance in relation to all manifestation, must in no way be manifested in this world itself, but can only serve as support or root to whatever is manifested therein, and that in consequence sensible qualities cannot be inherent in it, but on the contrary must proceed from forms implanted in it. This is a very complicated way of saying that this materia secunda, which is substance in the relative sense, excuse me, can only be a substance, substare, stand underneath and be a support or root to the whole of whatever is being manifested, if and only if it ultimately proceeds from forms, which now again is essence, which is eidos, implanted in it. And again, he says this amounts to saying that anything that is quality must necessarily be referred to essence. So they go together. And now he tries to very concisely get to the heart of what modern materialism really is, and that is the reduction of quality to quantity. So you have to understand that this essence and substance, they go together. And once you neglect essence, which is the pole of quality, and focus on only substance or quantity, you have arrived, he writes, by a, he's referring to the modern physicists, by a logic, a sort of logic of error, to the point of confusing the two, and thence to the attribution of quality itself to their matter as such. And they end by assigning all reality to matter. That's materialism, or at least all that they are capable of recognizing as reality, and it is this that constitutes materialism properly so called. I really haven't seen a better and more penetrating insight into the nature of materialism. You might say, materialism, but he puts it in the context of this whole notion of materia prima, materia secunda, the whole notion of quality, quantity, essence, substance. It's very, 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 very profound,
succinct
analysis. Yeah, this is a succinct statement, but it has a very, very profound amount of thought and an argumentation that's behind it that I think most people who are rightly so opposed to materialism would not necessarily be aware of, but they would be right for denouncing materialism. But this is really the heart of materialism. So materia secunda he says cannot be devoid of all determination. That's clear enough, because then it would, total indistinction is materia prima, this theoretical idea. At the same time, he says you can't have a kind of generalized materia secunda, because materia secunda must be determined in accordance with, the parameters of the world in which we live, the boundary conditions, if you like, in such a way, determined in such a way that it, namely materia secunda, can effectively play the part of substance, substare, the root, the support, in relation to this world in particular, and not in relation to anything else. Now, what is the nature of this qualification or determination of materia secunda? Well, he wants to specify that, and for that he refers directly to the writing and thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. He never footnotes, so I don't know where he's getting these quotes. That would be an interesting assignment for someone to go and trace all of these. I don't know. Maybe you can find some eminent Thomist who could help us here and locate these concise Latin locutions in their original sources.
I know many of them are hiding out, but I think I could track one down.
Okay. Yeah, if you can find one. So he says that Aquinas then gets to the heart of this determination that we have in materia secunda by saying that materia secunda is materia signata quantitate, which is the title of the chapter. In other words, matter, namely second matter, materia secunda, is that matter which is marked or designated by quantity. So what's the key point? Quality is therefore not inherent in it. Mm-hmm. Quality's got to be there for it to completely manifest, but it's not inherent in it, and it is not that which makes it what it is, mm-hmm. even if quality is considered only in relation to the sensible order. Its place is taken by quantity, which thus really is ex parte materiae, meaning it really is that quantity truly stands on the side of matter. Quantity is one of the very conditions of existence in the sensible or corporeal world. It is the condition that belongs most exclusively of all to that world. Therefore, as might have been expected, the definition of materia secunda in question cannot concern anything other than this world. Okay, but it does concern this world as a whole, because everything that's in this world is, to state the obvious, subject to quantity in some way or another. But that's really what he considers to be the heart of the matter of materia secunda, and he doesn't really. he says the definition given is therefore fully sufficient. In other words, to say that materia secunda is materia signata quantitate is in itself sufficient, and we don't have to go into electronegativity and this, that, and the other thing. Although it does have those other properties as well. So he says the definition given is therefore fully sufficient, and there is no need to attribute to materia secunda, as has been done to modern matter, properties that can in no way really belong to it. It can be said that quantity, regarded as constituting the substantial side of our world, is, as it were, its basic or fundamental condition. And again, he wants to point out that you also can't go too far with this. And he gives the example saying that the foundation of a building must not be confused with its superstructure. While there is only a foundation, there is still no building, although the foundation is indispensable to the building. In the same way, while there is only quantity, there is still no sensible manifestation. That's the key. Although sensible manifestation has its very root in quantity, quantity considered by itself is only a necessary quote-unquote presupposition. But it explains nothing. It's just a base. It is indeed a base, he says, but nothing else. And mustn't be forgotten that the base is, by definition, that which is situated at the lowest level. Yeah. That's, again, very important. The symbolism of directions and space. Finally, so then he concludes this paragraph by saying, so that the reduction of quality to quantity is intrinsically nothing but a reduction of the higher to the lower. And some have very rightly attributed this very character to materialism. To claim to derive the greater from the lesser is indeed one of the most typical of modern aberrations. Now he wants to talk about different kinds of quantity. So there is discontinuous quantity or discrete quantity, which is nothing but number, and there's also continuous quantity. In traditional philosophy, discrete quantity was studied in arithmetic. Continuous quantity is geometry, Euclid, etc. So discrete quantity is pure number. But that's number as understood before, as 1, 2, 3. There's no negative numbers. There's no...
It's natural numbers, whole numbers.
Yeah. And continuous quantity is concerned with spatial and temporal, magnitudes, spatial magnitudes or temporal duration. There's also temporal succession, but the notion for the ancients, of an actual point in time doesn't really make sense. And it all comes down to now the debate in Euclid, or in the comments by Heath in Euclid from all these guys who were studying Euclid, about what is really a point.
Yeah, but then how do you explain Book 7 of Euclid, which deals with number, exclusively? How is that continuous? If discrete, what is the term? Discrete.
Quantity.
Discrete quantity is number, and continuous quantity is geometry. But in Book 7 of Euclid, he deals with number. How do you explain that?
Well, because discrete magnitudes can also be represented
geometrically. Mm-hmm. I see.
Right, you can... Here's the problem. You have to define a unit. So you take your compass, because we don't use measurement. We only have a compass and an unmarked straight edge. And then what's the first construction, that they actually... Well, not construction. What's the first proposition in Euclid? The pons asinorum. Isn't that what it's called?
The first ever construction?
Well, all you do is you put that down and you get an equilateral triangle. But that what that means is that you're drawing a circle, and when you draw a circle, you have defined the unit by the radius, and then you measure everything with that, right? So as soon as this is actually chapter 3. As soon as you introduce measure,
I see,
there is quantity. Now, there are incommensurable quantities, and this was the great esoteric teaching of the Pythagoreans, that the diagonal of the square is an incommensurable. Yet it can be represented by a discrete. So if you constructed a square, and then took your straight edge, again, there's no measurement on that, and you drew a line, you have the diagonal of the square, and the diagonal of the square will always be root 2 in proportion to root 2. The diagonal of the cube will be in proportion to root 3. So even though, to put it in modern terms, the square root of 2 is not a rational number. It's an irrational number. It doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense. It means it can't be expressed as a ratio of two whole numbers. But so you can never really write it. Like you can write 2 or 5 or 6 or 9, but you can draw it. Yeah. And then also, I think in Book 7, there's also the notion that of numbers which are numbers which are composite. And so what are they composed of? They're composed of prime numbers. And so every composite number has a prime factorization. So, but those are always discrete. In the sense that, right, a prime number can't be a decimal or a fraction, right? So I don't think that Book 7 is out of place.
I see.
Yeah. So where did that leave us? All right, so he talks about how quantity presents itself in diverse modes. We have discontinuous or discrete quantity. That's nothing but number. And then we have continuous quantity. He has an interesting footnote here about discrete quantity. Footnote 2 at the bottom of page 20. He says the pure idea of number is essentially that of whole number. and it is evident that the sequence of the whole numbers constitutes a discontinuous series. In other words, there's gaps in between. All the extensions that have been applied to this idea and that have given rise to the notions of fractional numbers and incommensurable numbers, the irrationals we were just talking about, are real alterations and only in fact represent the efforts that have been made to reduce as far as possible the intervals of numerical discontinuity so as to lessen the imperfection inherent in the application of number to continuous magnitudes. So magnitude, discrete magnitude, cannot completely be applied to continuous magnitude. But you can have a continuous magnitude, which is the square root of 2. You can draw it. Yeah. But you can't apply number as understood by them as discrete to continuous magnitudes. There's always a gap, a discontinuity, an incommensurable, they can't be reconciled. And who knows, what exactly the esoteric teaching of that is, but that's a whole other subject. So continuous quantity is associated with time and space. Now, among all these modes, he asks the question, which is the one that can most accurately be called pure quantity? So if we've got discontinuous quantity or discrete of continuous, which one is more like pure quantity? Now, here he says that this question is really important because Descartes, who is the starting point of a lot of problems, many specifically modern philosophical and scientific conceptions, as he says, as Guénon writes, he says that Descartes tried to define matter in terms of extension. In other words, in continuous quantity. And to make his definition the principle of a quantitative metaphysics. So he says this is really the 0 point of materialism. It's not full-blown materialism, but it is the beginning of mechanism. And it might be tempting, he says, to draw the conclusion that extension as being directly inherent in matter represents the fundamental mode of quantity, but he doesn't agree with that. Because he says, on the other hand, St. Thomas Aquinas, when he says that numerus stat ex parte in materia, that number stands on the side of matter, seems rather to suggest that number constitutes the substantial basis of this world, and therefore it is number, again, substantial basis. So quantity goes with substance again, with hule. That is number that must properly be looked on as pure quantity, and the attribution of a basic character number is in perfect agreement with the fact that in the Pythagorean doctrine, number is taken by inverse analogy as the symbol of the essential principle of things.
So number is pure quantity.
Well, hold on. If you take number as just as a pure quantity, used he says by inverse analogy, then that becomes associated not with substance but with essence.
Right.
Because there it's the Platonic idea. Yeah. We're going at the higher level.
Ascending.
Yeah. So matter as understood then by Descartes with this extension, he says, is not the materia secunda of the scholastics. And it's really the earliest example, according to Guénon probably, of the modern physicist notion of matter. So what Guénon is saying here is that the Cartesian notion that matter is ultimately characterized by extension is not correct. Matter is, ultimately characterized by, or signified, or designated, or marked by quantity, not extension. Extension is one possible mode of quantity. You can measure the length, width, breadth of something, but it's not the same as materia secunda. So then he has some further remarks about the Cartesian definition of matter, but they're not really the main point in this chapter. He says that in chapter 4, he will look at the notion of extension more closely. And although extension in space, obviously, is quantitative in character, like everything else belonging to the sensible world, it cannot be regarded as pure quantity. Another interesting remark he makes here is it may also be observed that the theories which go furthest in the direction of a reduction to the quantitative are generally atomistic. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
In one way or another. That is to say, they introduce a discontinuity, because if you posit some kind of an atom, those are discrete parts.
Yes.
Yep.
And so that there has to be a discontinuity then. So they introduce discontinuity into their notion of matter in such a way as to bring it into much closer relation to the nature of number than to that of extension. And the very fact that the material from which bodies are formed cannot in any case be conceived otherwise than as extended is never anything but a source of contradiction in all atomism. So any attempt to express continuous quantity in terms of discrete is doomed to failure. And so when you do that, you have to fill up the discrete number line, so to speak. You have to fill in the gaps. And he hasn't said this here, but I would like to, if I may interject into the discourse here. This is one of the big problems with scientism. Because these physicists forget that, they mistake their models for the real world. So they think that, you can actually talk about a point in space. You actually can't. There's always some extension. So, a point doesn't really exist. There's always going to be some space in between. So anytime you introduce analogically a notion of a point as in terms of some sort of a discrete thing, but the point, is a nothing, and you have an infinitude of them that make up a line.
Yeah.
But that again is just a conception. It's not an actual infinite. Yeah, so this is how it goes, and that's why there's also no such thing really as an instant in time, beyond the present. But the present is always in between two, and it's always going away. So these are the kind of paradoxical problems that come up in the discussion of these things. But there really is no, in the external world, this idea of some sort of a Cartesian mathematical space and all of this. It's not true. And they have all sorts of nonsensical abstractions that don't exist. He says this at the end of the chapter. A frictionless, massless pulley. Let's just let's assume that this that this plane, there's no friction here. Or if they introduce friction, it's always, these problems are all very, very, very contrived. I mean, they do work for engineering and other purposes. But again, are they a true understanding of the ultimate nature of things? No, because as Genon said, modern science actually lacks all explanatory value because it doesn't go from top down. It doesn't proceed from above downward. I think we're almost done. So here there's this remark about atoms. Another cause of confusion is the habit, he says, that has grown up of considering body and matter as nearly synonymous. Now he says bodies, actually bodies are in no sense materia secunda, which is not met with anywhere in the manifested existences of this world. Bodies only proceeding from it as from their substantial principle. But number, like materia secunda, is never perceived directly and in a pure state in the corporeal world, and it is number that must without doubt be considered primarily as constituting the fundamental mode in the domain of quantity. The other modes of quantity are only derived from number, that is to say, they are, so to speak, only quantity by virtue of their participation in number. So bodies, according to him, then, are not materia secunda. We can only speak of quantity, I suppose, in virtue, with reference to bodies by virtue of their participation in number. All right, so in these other modes, presumably he's referring to bodies as one of those modes, even when quantity is the predominant element, it always appears as more or less mixed with quality. Thus it is that the conceptions of space and of time, here we go, despite the efforts of modern mathematicians, can never be exclusively quantitative. Unless, indeed, it be accepted that they must be reduced to entirely empty notions without contact with any kind of reality. So they would like to, generalize. And in fact, no two points are really the same. No two instances are really the same. Tomorrow is not yesterday, and no two, they'll just say, well, all points in time are the same. They're not. Time also has a qualitative character. He's not getting into this.
Yes.
But that's what we find in, for example, in astrology. Or what we find in any ritual, in any religious rituals that are time dependent.
Right.
Every night is not the same in Islamic tradition. There's Laylatul Qadr. That's very important. It's in Ramadan. And it's considered, worship in that night is considered to be equal to 1,000 months. Right? You can't just go on the pilgrimage to Mecca at any old time. It's time. You can't just pray the 5 daily prayers at any time that you like. In any religion, there's a prayer time. There are books of hours and so forth.
Yes.
Right? And so they had a notion of a qualitative nature of time as well. Even something as obvious, the seasons are different. They're not the same. And similarly, they'll just say, all right, well, a liter of water is a liter of water. And at the most they'll say, well, there's fresh water, there's salt water, maybe there are impurities in water, but let's say we have an idealized water with a completely neutral pH in laboratory conditions. So they'll say any one beaker of water with an equivalent amount is the same. Is that true? What if on one glass of water you pronounce the supreme name of God and you blow on it? That's an Islamic example. Or you consecrate it according to the relevant and proper rituals of Christian blessing, for example, or some other religion. It wouldn't be regarded as the same. Now they'll say, oh, that's just all in your mind. You guys don't know what, this and that. And, we can't really measure it. We can't really... Again, it's all reduction to quantity. Although, on that topic, there's a Japanese researcher who has done work on water. And I don't know if he uses an electron. I don't know what kind of imaging technology he uses. Must be some sort of very advanced, electron microscope or some sort of... I don't know what the exact imaging is. But he finds that water that's been preyed upon, and just irrespective of the religion, Buddhist, whatever, is different from water that hasn't been, or water that has been subjected to, if you put it next to some heavy metal music, for example. So there, in the case of music, there are vibrations, and not every sound is the same. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a science of music. And there is a science of music. Of course, now almost anything goes, right? All kinds of nonsense is taken as music. But those are vibrations. Well, can we measure every kind of vibration? In other words, it seems that water is capable of taking vibratory imprints, and that those vibratory imprints are not necessarily anything that is measurable on any kind of spectrum or within the existent measuring technology. Apparently, this Japanese researcher has come to some has done some research on this and has somehow designed an apparatus whereby some sort of measurement can take place. Again, obsession with quantity. I mean, if that Japanese guy never did it, doesn't matter to me. I know what happens. As did all traditional men. But all of these things have been changed, and they've all been manipulated. Is space the same? No. If that were true, then the traditional symbolic directions of space and traditional geomancy, or what you find like in Chinese feng shui or vastu shastra in the Indic tradition, right. You can't just build a mosque in any old direction.
Yeah.
You can't just build it any place. Even there were rules for the placement of temples. There were rituals for groundbreaking. There were astrological alignments. I'm sure a lot of this stuff is probably in the Western world in Vitruvius.
Yeah.
There are, there's whole canons of proportion and directions and everything. For example, for the construction of Hindu temples, the same was there in Egyptian temples, same was there in ancient Mayas. There's a whole field called archaeoastronomy where they realized that these things had various alignments. And in the case of the ancient Egyptians, some temples would only be constructed for a certain amount of time. And then they would be dismantled because the temporal and cyclical conditions had changed. And therefore that temple's time was over. It was abrogated, as it were, to use an Islamic term. So all this is extremely important, and this has all been forgotten about. But Genon truly understood. Etc. Let's just conclude this. And it is not the science of today, and is not the science of today in actual fact made up to a large extent of such empty notions, purely conventional in character and without the least effective significance. And of course, he's alluding to these frictionless and massless ropes and pulleys and so forth that you find in physics, these kind of abstractions. So just to conclude and segue into the next chapter, he wants to deal with the notion of measure and how that relates to manifestation. And the conception of measure is, of course, the very foundation of geometry, because geometria in Greek, right, is the measure of the geo. Is it called geo or Gaia, or what is the earth, right?
Yeah, do you remember
Gaia.
Gaia.
And so that's what happens in the next chapter. And, of course, that will be developed further in the next lesson. And so we will just conclude here. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best. Thank you once again for watching.